In the previous video, we created our Lambda function, which we're going to use to serve our static React app. And we've built this into a Docker image. So to be able to deploy and run this workload in AWS, we're going to need to have a ECR, Elastic Container repository available that we can store this image in before we're actually able to deploy our Lambda function itself and that workload. So today we're going to use CloudFormation as our infrastructure as code, and we'll deploy the ECR repository independently of the actual workload just to make things a little bit more simple. So we'll create a new file here, which is our prerequisite.yaml, and this is what we'll use to deploy our ECR registry. So we need our parameters for CloudFormation. In this case, we're really only going to need the one thing because all we're deploying is our ECR repository. So let's have a repository name, we'll call that. Need to give it a type. Type's just string in this case. Oops. And description, name, the name of the ECR repository to store images. Cool. Alrighty. So resources. What are we deploying? Obviously we're going to have our ECR repository itself, so let's create a new resource named that. Repository, we'll give it a type, AWS type, so this is an AWS, it's going to be ECR repository, and it's going to have some properties. Alright, so first thing, we're naming our repository, so the repository name, which is going to reference our parameter that we've passed in. So let's do that. Repository name. And then the other thing that we're going to be concerned with, so this would be enough to actually go and create our repository, but the other thing that we need to do is actually allow Lambda or the Lambda service to access it to retrieve the image in order to run up an instance of the function. So in this case, we're going to have to define a policy. So policy text is how we pass that in. And I've actually got a copy of the policy that we need in this case, so I'm just going to paste that in. So in here, we're allowing Lambda, so the Lambda service, that's our service principal, to get an authorization token. So it's allowed to authorize against our repository. And then we're allowing it to pull images. So there's no write access here. Lambda's only able to retrieve that image for execution. So that's the second policy there. So nothing particularly complicated. So let's go ahead and deploy that. So if we revisit our make file, we've got a few deployment options down here. We've got a validation step, which we can use to validate our file. We're not currently deploying our workload. So if we just temporarily disable that in the make file, we'll jump down here. So we can obviously just list our make tasks. So if we go make, deploy, and what we want to do for deployment at the moment is do a validate. That should go through and validate our CloudFormation template. Just make sure things are correct. Okay, so it didn't return any errors, so that's great. Let's restore that for the next time around when we get to our workload. And now we're going to deploy that prerequisite stack, which is this task here. So let's get that underway. And we're doing that by using the AWS CloudFormation or AWS CLI running CloudFormation deploy. Deploy is much nicer than create stack because it's going to actually go, as you can see in the output down here, it's creating change sets for us. And it's going to allow us to roll things back and forward much easier especially if we want to introduce a delta. We can actually go and create those change sets ourselves if we wanted to, but in this case it's doing it all for us, which is fantastic. So we'll let it do its thing. It can open up. I've logged into my Amazon account here. If we refresh this, we can see our stack has already been created, and our resources, we've got our repository. Beautiful. No images there. If we check the permissions, we can see that we've allowed the Lambda service principal, and it's allowed to retrieve images. Great. Alrighty. So now let's go ahead and commit those changes. So you can see I've got my prerequisite stack there. That seems pretty good. We've managed to deploy it successfully. Git commit. Cool. So yeah, creating prerequisite stack to deploy our ECR repository. Excellent. And let's go and build ourselves an image and check that we can upload that. So back to make, we'll make build. We've already got our React app available. If we drop into here, we can see there's already the static artifacts in the build directory, so we didn't need to rebuild that. So now we've packaged that into our new Lambda ECS test image. We also need to authenticate ourselves to ECR. So let's go and do that. I've got a make task for that as well. So here we are, ECR login. That'll authenticate us locally. Perfect. And then we can do make push, and that's going to push the newly built image into our repository. So given this is a brand new repository, we're needing to push all layers. One of the beautiful things about Docker is that, assuming that we're consistent in the way that we lay things out, and we put the things that are going to change the most further down the file, we don't need to push all of those larger layers each time around. We're only going to really push the delta. So at the moment, we're creating a new image here. We're pushing pretty much everything that's in that Amazon Node.js 20 image into our repository. We're adding our function and we're adding our static code. So if I was to modify the React app, and only the React app, and then we ran this Docker build again and then did a push, it's only needing to push this layer here. So ideally, if you lay things out based on things that change the least are further up your file, things that change more are down. Another concern could be that if you've got multiple child containers that use the same parent, you might want to have, or if you've got very, very similar things across given containers, maybe they're not even from the same parent, but they've got a few steps in them that are quite similar. Anything that's consistent between them that's higher up will be reused, so that way you're more efficient in the way that you store your images. So just something to think about with Docker. Alrighty, so we can see that we've pushed that there. So if we refresh, we can see we've got our new image. Excellent. So that's our ECR repository done, and we've deployed our first image, or we've released our first image into that repository. So let's now go and create our first stack for the workload. Or in this case, I guess it's our second stack that we're going to be deploying. So we'll just call this one workload.yaml. And we're going to want essentially the same parameters. Let's just copy this from our prereq. So we want the repository name because we're going to need to be able to reference that. But we're more importantly going to want to reference the actual artifact we're wanting to pull out of there. So let's create another parameter here, which is going to be our artifact version. Its type's also going to be string. Give it a description as well. And this is just the version of the Lambda artifact. Oops. Lambda artifact to deploy. Given that's what our infrastructure as code does. Excellent. All right, so we're going to need obviously a definition for our Lambda here. Lambda is going to require an IAM role for anything it needs access to. So we'll need an IAM role there. We're going to need a log group. We want to be able to make sure that we can manage where our logs are stored. So we'll create that. So yeah, I think that'll probably be something to get us started, and we'll try that for our first deployment. So let's go and create our log group. And that's obviously going to have its own type as well. AWS logs. And the resource type is log group. Cool. And that'll have properties. And obviously it needs a name, which the attribute is log group name. Let's use a convention for this. So we'll substitute a string. So CloudFormation gives us some helpful variables which we can use when we're deploying. So the stack name is one of them, which is really useful. So let's use stack name and the repository name as our convention for resource naming, just to kind of keep them unique. If you want to deploy multiple stacks, we can do that and we're not going to have a collision. Repository name. Cool. So that's our log group name. It's pretty much all we need, but given that this is a test thing, let's reduce the retention period. We don't need to keep things forever. So retention in days is that property. We'll just set it to a week. Cool. All right, so now we've got a log group. The next thing we'll do, let's start defining our Lambda itself. So type being AWS Lambda, and it's a function. Properties, just like the previous one. So we need to name our function, so we'll do that. So function name. This, we'll just call it the same as our repository, I guess. So let's reference that parameter. Actually, we don't need to put this in parentheses. So repository. So just for anyone who's not familiar with the way CloudFormation works, so a reference to a resource or a parameter, you can just directly put the name of it in and access it. If you're substituting a string, you need to put the parentheses around it. Okay, so now we're obviously needing to provide it some kind of code. In the traditional way of doing it, we'd provide it path to a zip file. In this case, we build our stuff into a Docker image. So the image URI that we're going to provide for our registry, we're going to sub this as well. This string is going to be, obviously it's part of our account ID. So we've got an AWS variable that's available to us to get our account ID. And in ECR, so if we go to our repositories, we can see our URI is here. So to bring that in, account name .docker, so this is what we want here. ECR. And then our region, we can actually substitute with another magic variable courtesy of AWS CloudFormation. And then dot Amazon AWS. And we'll use our repository name because that's what we're referring to. Oops. So that's our image URI. We also need to tell Lambda what our handler function is that we've created. So in our source directory, we've got our Lambda function, and we copy that into our source, into the task root as is. So we can do that in the image config. And the image config, we're just changing, in this case, we're actually just setting what the Docker command is for the image. So the command takes a list, and that's going to be lambda function dot handler. So lambda function being the file that we're loading, and handler being the name of the JavaScript function that we've defined inside. Excellent. So there's a few other bits and pieces. Given that we're not actually doing a zip file, we need to also specify the package type, because the default there is not going to be the same. Package not going to be the same as a zip file. So in this case, it's an image. So we'll set that, and we are going to give it our log group that we've just created. So logging config, we can set log group to reference our log group up here. We'll reference that resource, and we can define our architecture. This is not necessary in all cases. I am building on an Apple M3 processor, so it is ARM, the image that I'm building. We can cross-compile or build those images for x86 and publish them all together, but given that AWS's Graviton processors are the most cost-effective resources that they got, let's just stick with ARM all the way through in today's example. Need to specify the memory, so let's do that. So the memory size, we don't need a lot for this, it's just returning some static files, and most of them pretty small, so let's make it 128 meg. Timeouts, most of these things will return pretty quickly, so don't expect timeout to be a problem at all, but let's just set it just for completeness. We'll give it 10 seconds. Okay, and we've forgotten a couple of things. So we need our role. So this function's going to need an IAM role. We're going to need to define that. So let's put that as a to-do. We'll come back to the role, and we're going to deploy this one as a private Lambda. So in order to do that, we're going to need to provide some VPC config. And we're going to give it a security group, which we're going to need to create. We don't have a security group yet, and that just wants the IDs. So that'll be a list. I spelled security correctly, and we're going to have to come back once we've got that as well. And the last thing is the subnets, or in this case it'll be subnet IDs is the key that we're looking for. Rightio. So for our subnets, and we don't have to provide the VPC ID in this case, but subnets itself will pass those in. So let's create our subnets parameter, or let's call it subnet IDs, because that's actually what we're passing in. They have a type, and we can explicitly define that. So let's do a list of, whoops, I forget the right parentheses. So a list of AWS EC2 subnet ID. So now we're going to make sure that CloudFormation will validate when we pass the subnet IDs in that we've actually given it a list of IDs. Description, let's give it that. So it's just going to be the subnets to use, I guess. Subnets to use, excellent. So we can take this and reference it down here. That way we've got our subnets, so that's now available for our Lambda. Next cab off the rank, let's create our security group. Lambda security group, that's going to be an AWS EC2 security group. Obviously we've got some properties. We're going to need a description. Security group for the Lambda function. That's what it's used for. And we need to know the VPC that we're going to deploy the security group to, which is going to lead us to our next parameter, parameter that we need to pass in. VPC ID is what we need. And we're going to need to reference that. So let's go and create our VPC. So that'll be our resource, so VPC ID. That's what we're going to pass in here. And that's going to have a type as well. AWS. It's also an EC2 resource. VPC ID, and that way we'll get that nice validation again, and a description for it being, I guess it's just our VPC to use. Excellent. Alright, so now we've got 4 parameters that are being passed in. Our VPC ID for our security group, which is being deployed, and we better reference our newly created security group in our Lambda definition. Excellent. So now we're pretty much there. We need to do our IAM role, and I think that's all we're missing for the Lambda itself. So let's go and add a role for this Lambda. We'll call it, like, say, Lambda execution role, maybe? Something like that. Something that makes sense anyway. And the type of this is just going to be an IAM role, so AWS IAM role. Properties. So we're going to need a name, obviously. So we'll use our convention that we've been working with there, which is the stack name, repository name. So we'll bring that down. Given that these are roles, let's just add Lambda to that. We may end up with multiple things of a similar name if we end up creating another role for other resources within this account. So that gives us a role. The role doesn't do much at the moment. One of the things that we do need to do is actually allow the Lambda service to assume that role. So let's add an assume role policy document. Whoops. Assume role policy document, which is going to have, you know, the usual version, declarations. So I'll do that, and then our statement. So what do we need to do? We need to allow, so we're going to have an effect, which is allow our principal if we spell it correctly, we'll allow our principal, in this case it's a service principal, which is going to be lambda dot Amazon AWS.com. Cool. What are we going to do? We're going to allow that to do an action. So we're going to allow it to use the STS service, to assume this role. Cool. Assume role. All right. We need to give it some policies. What is it allowed to do? So there's going to be a few things that we need to do in here. So for our first policy, actually we'll put the statements together. So we'll just define one policy. Policy name. This should just use our convention. We'll actually name the policy the same way we name the role in this case, because it's the one policy for that. And we need to give it the policy document. Oops, no, thanks autocomplete. We're not doing an assume role, so oops. We just want policy document. And the policy document, we can give it the same version as the previous statement. Okay, so statement. So now we're going to have a couple of things that we need to do in here. So one of the things that we need to do is allow access to our log group that we defined above. So let's do that. So the actions that we want to define in this case are for CloudWatch logs. So that'll be logs. We need to be able to create a stream. So we've created the group, but this Lambda, every time it invokes, is going to create a unique stream for each invocation of Lambda. So we need to allow it to do that. And we also need to allow it to put events. So put log events, otherwise it's not actually going to be able to write anything to it. Alrighty, so where are we applying these actions? So if we define our resource here, this is going to need to be our log group. Can we refer to it directly? I think Lambda will, I think CloudFormation will resolve that for us. So can we ref, we'll give it a go. We'll see what that does. Well, actually, it might even want the ARN. So we can use get atta log group .arn, and that way we should be able to grab the ARN for that log group. So we'll see what that does for us. Okay, now we've got another permission that we need to add. Well, actually, before we do that, let's name this. So give it an SID, so a statement ID. This is allow Lambda to send logs to CloudWatch, something like that. And we'll do another one for our next one. We need to allow Lambda to manage ENIs because we're giving it access to our VPC. We want it to be able to get itself, I guess, a network interface or an ENI within our VPC. So this may or may not be something that we're actually going to use, but because it's a private Lambda, I believe we need to include it. So we'll just do it anyway for the time being. So Lambda to manage ENIs. Alrighty, so the effect again is going to be to allow. So by default, IAM's not really allowing a role to do anything. We can explicitly deny things, but we don't have anything that we have a purpose for that for at the moment. So let's do our allow actions. So effect allow the actions that we want. Okay, so there's a bunch of EC2 things that we need to be able to do when deploying ENI. So I'll copy those in from the documentation, and we need to define our resource for that. So this is for EC2 itself, so there's nothing particular that we're deploying, so we'll give it a wildcard and say it applies to everything. Excellent, so that's our role. So our Lambda's now got the ability to write logs, and it's got the ability to create network interfaces for itself to run within our VPC. Excellent, so now we should be able to reference our newly defined role. Get rid of an extra line. So we have our Lambda function. It's got everything that we need on there. So we've named it. It's got the image URI. We've set our handler function, or we're using the image command to do that. We've changed the package type. It's now image. We've got a role, execution role. Be interesting to see if we've got the right resource for that. We may need to come back and get an ARN for that, but we'll go with this for now. We've got our logging config pointing to our log group, so that should be what we need. We've set our memory size, timeout, and our VPC has been configured. Excellent. So that should give us our starting resources. So let's give that a go. So if you remember with our make file before, we've got a deploy validate, which just confirms that our CloudFormation template is correct. So let's go and run that again. That'll check both CloudFormation templates we've now defined. So the first one's good. No, we've broken the second one. Okay. Unrecognized parameter, AWS EC2 VPC ID. Okay. So in that case, let's just jump into the AWS docs for that from CloudFormation. So this is for defining an actual VPC, but we want the ID, VPC ID, AWS EC2 VPC. Oh, I see what I've done. So I've missed a colon here. So we can see that the resource was correct, and then the property that we wanted to validate against, which was the ID, requires the double colon between it. Alrighty, let's run that validate again. Cool. We can even check our exit code. 0. Excellent. So that's good. So this time around we can do our deployment, and that should give us our Lambda. So we've got we did our deploy prereq before to create our ECR repository. So this time around we're going to deploy the workload. Okay, and CloudFormation is going to go create our change set. So if we jump back over here, we should find ourselves with a new stack. Yes. And we can have a look at the events. So we can see it's starting to create. No failures so far. That's good. Fingers crossed it stays that way, but we'll soon find out. Okay, so our log group's been created. Our security group's been created. We're now going and creating the IAM role. Some resources like IAM roles and that will take a little bit longer than others to create. But they're usually not too long. Oops, no, we've got deletions going on. Okay, so we've broken something. So the create for Lambda failed. Why has that failed? Pattern. Oh, the role pattern. Ah, right. Okay, yeah, this is what I was thinking before, whether we could actually refer directly to our role or if we needed to directly access the ARN. So like what we've done up here for our resource for the log group, we've done this. So we might borrow that. If we come down here, so for our role, we directly referenced our CloudFormation resource. But what we actually want is the ARN of that role, because that's what Lambda's expecting to use as its reference. So let's update that. Has our stack cleaned up? Okay, so it's in rollback complete. Let's just go and delete that one. So we've got a clean environment to work in. Okay, so that's gone, and we'll run our deploy again. Okay, if we come back over here, there we go, we've got a new stack coming up. Give ourselves a little bit more room. Okay, got our log group, got our security group. And hopefully this time, after our role's been deployed, there's our role, Lambda will start deploying. We shouldn't get that pattern issue where it was trying to reference the role ARN. Nope, okay, something's unhappy again. I think I know why that's not working. So at the moment, we're referring to just the repository. What we actually need to do is provide the artifact that we're wanting to pull down. So we need to add the artifact version on here. So if we come up, we've got our parameter artifact version, and we're now applying that here. So let's clear that broken stack again. And we'll create it again, and hopefully this time we'll have some success. And with some post-production magic, I'll speed this up to the completion of our stack. Okay, so now we've got our first workload stack deployed. So if we look over here at resources, we've got our Lambda, we've got our IAM role, we have our security group, and we've got a log group. So we can jump over into the Lambda and have a look in here. So let's do a test. So you can't see, because it's an image, we're not able to see the code. So if you do a zip file with a small code base, you can actually have a look at the code in here. Given it's inside a container, that's not going to work for us. Oops. So let's do a test event. Test one. Hello world template. So our deployment's going to be behind a load balancer. So we want an application load balancer. So this will mimic the request from an ALB. And this is doing a post. We don't support posts. We're only allowing to retrieve static assets. So let's do a get. And the path to the resource that we want is going to be index.html. We want the file that's in the root. So let's give that a go. Test. Alrighty, and here's our response from our Lambda. So we've got a 200, our headers are empty, which if you remember back in our code, we've defined headers, but we haven't actually implemented anything at the moment. And we've got a payload, which is base64. Excellent. So that's Lambda. And if we jump back here, we've got our log group. We can go in here. We should be able to see the logs from that test event. So we've got, let's just expand the window a little bit more. We've got our stream, which is just created by Lambda, and we don't see a lot. So you can see over here in the code base that we currently don't log anything, so we might want to address that. So we're just seeing the Lambda invocation itself at the moment. You can see here the duration. So it didn't run for long, used 65 meg of memory, so 128 seems about right for what we're currently doing. Keep an eye on that should we start consuming more for any particular reason. So now we're going to switch our focus to the load balancer, and we will implement that in the next video.